There is a version of a love story that never makes the front page. No slow-motion montages, no whispered confessions to a camera crew, just two of the most famous faces on Earth, 6 children, and a private jet somewhere over the Atlantic. And then, somewhere between the dark water and the California coast, 12 years of history came apart inside a single aircraft. Cabin, September 14, 2016. The plane had left Nice. A family holiday was ending. The way family holidays always end: bags, exhaustion. The long sigh of a return flight. But that flight did not land as it began. What happened inside that cabin would trigger federal investigators, lead to a sealing order for the court records, and set in motion an 8-year divorce process. One of the longest, quietest, and most expensive separations in Hollywood history. And the question that trailed the story was never simply whether the marriage could survive. The real question was something far more unsettling. How does the most photographed romance of a generation turn into a Cold War? To understand that, the clock has to turn back more than a decade, to 2004. To a film set on the edge of Los Angeles where 2 actors were about to be cast as husband and wife. The film was called Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The premise was simple. 2 spies married to each other, each secretly working for a rival agency. A marriage built on a lie, a contract written in deception. No one on that set could have known how closely the story would echo the next 12 years. Brad Pitt was one of the most famous stars not just in America, but in the world. Angelina Jolie, meanwhile, was one of the most prominent actresses at the time. The attraction between them wasn't just part of the role. The people around them would eventually say so themselves, because there was a real connection developing in front of the cameras. There was only one problem. Brad Pitt was married to another actress, a woman named Jennifer Aniston, with whom he shared one of the most beloved celebrity marriages of the decade. What happened afterward continued to be talked about for years. But one thing was certain. Everything had happened all at once. Suddenly, Pitt and Aniston's marriage was over. Pitt and Jolie, meanwhile, were seen together for the first time in 2005. On a beach, with a child by their side. The world had a name for them within months. Brangelina. A single word that fused 2 people into one brand. Tabloid covers, supermarket headlines, breathless speculation over every photograph. But behind the brand, something quieter was being built. A family. Jolie had already adopted a son, Maddox, from Cambodia. Over the following years, the family grew. Zahara, adopted from Ethiopia. Pax, from Vietnam. Shiloh, born to the couple themselves. And finally, twins, Knox and Vivienne, 6 children. A blended family that crossed continents and cultures. In a town that treats relationships like seasonal releases, this looked like something permanent. And then there was the castle. In 2008, the couple did something no ordinary celebrity pair would do. They bought a vineyard, a sprawling estate in the south of France called Château Miraval. Not as a hobby, as a life. It was an old estate. It had stone walls and centuries-old vineyards. Together, they turned it into a place that produced one of the most successful rosé wines in the world. But Miraval was much more than a home to them. It was a place where they could get away from the cameras, where their 6 children could run around and play freely, and where they could breathe for a while. They were married there. In 2014, in a small chapel on the estate, the ceremony was private. The children walked the aisle. For a moment, it looked as though the fairy tale had finally found its ending. But stories like this don't always end where they seem to. Imagine the pressure of constantly being in the public eye. Every argument you have inevitably happens in front of people, and every silence is interpreted by others. It was no longer just their marriage. Millions of people were following them as if they were a story. That kind of pressure doesn't end everything all at once. Slowly and quietly, cracks begin to form. If these stories are what brought you here, subscribe. Hollywood's sealed files open here first. The public saw 2 people in love. The private record, the one that would later be fought over in courtrooms for the better part of a decade, told a different story. Jolie would later describe a marriage that had been under strain for years. Long separations, different priorities, a distance that no amount of jet fuel could close. Pitt's account differed, and in the space between those 2 accounts, the real story lived. There was one thing everyone knew. By the summer of 2016, problems had already begun in their marriage. They had barely been seen together for months. Rumors were coming out, followed by denials. Then that flight happened, September 14, 2016. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, a private jet carrying 2 adults and 6 children. What happened in the air that night has been described in court documents and disputed in every forum since. Jolie's account: an altercation. Words exchanged. An incident involving the children. She would later allege physical and verbal abuse during the flight, claims that would be investigated by the FBI. Pitt's account: a painful family argument that was blown out of proportion. He denied the abuse allegations consistently and categorically. The FBI closed its investigation without filing charges. 2 versions, 1 cabin, and a truth that the public may never fully see. What happened afterward was clear. 5 days after the plane landed, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce. Along with it, she sought custody of all 6 children. That request marked the beginning of the 8-year process ahead of them. Nothing was the same anymore. The real battle was just beginning. What followed took a shape no tabloid could have predicted. Not a clean break. A slow, grinding, multi-front conflict. One battle after another, each longer than the last. Call it a Cold War fought through lawyers, and like every Cold War, it had its fronts. The first issue was the custody of the children. The custody battle between the 2 famous names lasted for years. Private judges, closed hearings, experts, and psychologists were all involved in the case. In the middle of it all were 6 children who had become part of this legal battle. Temporary decisions were made and appeals were filed over the years. By 2019, it was becoming clear that the children needed stability in their lives. The second front was the castle, Château Miraval. The vineyard they had built together. In the divorce, the question became what to do with it. The answer on paper was simple enough. Keep co-owning it. Business partners, even as they became legal enemies, it did not work, because Miraval was never just a business. It was the symbol of the marriage, and symbols do not divide cleanly. By 2021, the dispute over the estate had its own name in the press. The War of the Rosé. Jolie sold her share of the winery. Pitt sued. The lawsuits multiplied. Fraud claims. Contract claims. Accusations filed, answered, and filed again. A vineyard that had once produced wine for celebrations now produced legal filings faster than it produced bottles. The third front was quieter, but stranger. In 2022, Jolie filed a lawsuit against the FBI, not against Pitt, against the agency that had investigated the 2016 flight and closed the case without charges. She wanted the records, the full file of what the federal government had found about that night. It was an unusual move. A private citizen demanding the internal records of a closed investigation. And it put the question of the flight, what actually happened at 30,000 feet, back at the center of the story, years after the world had moved on. Then, as suddenly as she had filed it, she dropped it. 2024. The lawsuit was withdrawn. What does it mean when someone stops asking for the file? It could mean many things. Closure, exhaustion, or the heavier possibility that some questions once asked become heavier than the answers. That was the pattern of the whole war. Everything took longer than anyone expected. Everything cost more than anyone admitted, but wars end, even cold ones. In December 2024, more than 8 years after that flight, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie reached a final divorce settlement. 8 years. The marriage itself had lasted roughly 11 years. The divorce took almost as long. The settlement covered assets and custody. It did not end every fight. The vineyard dispute continues to this day, grinding through courts on both sides of the Atlantic. But the marriage was finally legally dead. So what remains? Not the love story. That died on the plane or long before it. What remains is the question. Because this was never really a story about 2 celebrities falling in and out of love. It was a story about what happens when a private life becomes a public asset, when a marriage becomes a brand. When 6 children become part of a narrative the whole world feels entitled to watch. The 2 people at the center of it are not villains and not victims in any simple sense. They are 2 extraordinarily powerful individuals who built something together, and then spent a decade dismantling it piece by piece, in public, under floodlights. And here is the uncomfortable part. The audience never looked away. The world that made them famous was the same world that made the ending impossible to keep private. Was it true love, or was it a cold war from the very first photograph? The answer, like the marriage itself, may be both. A love story and a war story occupying the same 12 years. The same 6 children, the same stone walls of a French castle, and the rest, like the flight itself, was silence. If this story held you, like it. It helps the algorithm reach others who'd want to hear it. Comment the next icon whose fall should be opened.